not God's. That's from Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 20. Or in other words, for although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened, and professing to be wise, they became fools. They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible men and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. And even as they did not retain the knowledge of God, God gave them over to their own minds to do things which did not improve their lives. Or in other words, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, or her own way. That's Isaiah 53:6. Or in other words, but these, like natural beasts, speak evil of the things that they do not understand. They have forsaken the right way and gone astray. They are wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest. For with great sounding and empty speeches, they appeal to the base nature of humanity. They promise freedom. They themselves are slaves to corruption, for people are slaves to whatever has mastered them. 2 Peter 2:12-19. In other words, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves. And the Lord came down and saw the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, these are one people with one language, and this is what they do with it. Now nothing that they propose to do will be impossible. So the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth, and they ceased building their city, which was called Babel. It's Genesis 11:4-9. Or in other words, the serpent was the most crafty of the creatures the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God actually say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? To which the woman said, no, we eat from the fruit of the trees of the garden. It's just the tree in the center of the garden that God said, you shall not eat from it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. And then the serpent said to the woman, no, you won't die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and pleasing to look at and desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave it to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And their eyes were opened, but all they saw was their own weakness. It's Genesis 3:1-7. Or in other words, when you are invited to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, because one more honorable than you may be invited. And when your host comes and says to you, give up your seat to this man, in shame, you will have to move to the worst seat. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That, of course, was one of our readings for this morning, Luke 14. Or in other words, see if there has ever been such a thing. Nations do not forsake their gods, even when they are not gods. But my people have exchanged their actual glory for empty things that do not even make their lives better. Be astonished by this, O heavens, and terribly afraid. From our other reading this morning, Jeremiah chapter 2. Or in other words, for I do not know the good things, or that I do not do the good things that I want to do. But harmful things, those I keep on doing. Now, if I do the things I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. So I find as a rule that evil is present in me. A person who wants to do good. For I delight in the law of the Lord, but I see another law in myself, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin. With the mind, I serve the law of God, but with the body, the law of sin. So who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ, our Lord. That, of course, is Paul. It's Romans chapter 7, 19 through 25. It's a very Paul statement. Or in other words, final words for today, I promise. Well, no, but my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and made for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. And that was the end of our first scripture passage today, Jeremiah 2, verse 13. So broken cisterns, or I did right from the beginning have another title for my sermon this Sunday, which could have been the double-edged sin. It's a reference to this thing that just automatically happens when we allow something else to take control of our lives, something that is not God. And in what has become probably his best known non-Narnia work, a book called Mere Christianity, which I encourage anyone to read. It really does lay out the basics of Christianity. But C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity makes a comment that when he finally did sit down, and he came to a strong Christian faith later in his life, not in childhood, but when he finally did sit down and actually read the Bible, he was surprised. He expresses that he was surprised by how insistent the Bible actually is about there being a dark presence at work in this world. And here's the thing, you don't actually have to call the dark presence Satan. You don't have to believe that an individual creature we know as the devil actually exists. You can take these stories literally or not. Christian faith really is not dependent on the literal reality of these concepts. And in fact, I would argue that clinging to this idea of a literal Satan, whether it's true or not, it can become a distraction for us and prevent us from seeing the fuller meaning that these stories are trying to get across to us, because the truth of it is this dark presence, as it is presented in the Bible, also known as the law of the flesh that Paul speaks about in Romans and elsewhere, this thing that controls him, even though he does not want or choose to be controlled by it. This dark presence in the Bible is bigger than the devil. And if Satan does exist as an actual literal being, which I am completely open to, but if he does exist, he is just another servant of the dark presence. He is not its entirety. That's giving him way too much power, for one thing. And we do actually see that in what has become Satan's origin story, Genesis chapter 3, where the snake is just the cleverest of the creatures God has made. He is not some all-pervasive presence of darkness compelling or forcing the woman into sin. It is the woman's own choices beneath the tree in Eden that do that. Notice that the way the story is worded, it is her own desire. It's egged on by the serpent, yes. but her own desire already present in her, this other law that Paul warns us about, warring with the law of God. It is that and not some power that the snake somehow creates and unleashes that turns the woman into a sinner there in Eden. It is our own desire that pushes humanity over the line into sin, the desire specifically to become like God, knowing good and evil, but she doesn't read the fine print, as we so often don't. So then what is this dark presence? If we can't just conveniently blame everything on the devil, then what do we blame evil on? And what in the world does any of it have to do with broken cisterns or trying to make yourself look more important at a party? Let alone all those other verses I brought up at the beginning. My people have committed two evils. The prophet Jeremiah has God tell us that in chapter 2. They have forsaken me, God, the fountain of living waters. And they have made for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So this is the double-edged sin. This is the thing that just leads automatically to the other thing. Because let's look at what's actually happening here. These two evils, forsaking God, which can take many, many different forms. It boils down, I think, to any way in which God is decentralized from your life and from your sense of personal meaning too. And then the second sin is the digging of broken cisterns. And let's understand first and foremost that these cisterns are not meant literally. God did not have a problem with the ancient Hebrews going into the desert and digging themselves reservoirs for water. These are not literal cisterns, any more than God is a literal water fountain. The point of the verse is that walking away from God, walking away from this metaphorical source of living water, human beings still need water, still need these things that they would otherwise get from God. And so they are forced, walking away from God, they are forced into the other evil. They are forced to dig cisterns, which are ground repositories for water. But when the people dig these repositories for themselves, the repositories end up broken. And if you look at all the other verses that I read through this morning, and I do have a few printouts of those verses if anyone's interested in taking a second look, but if you do look through all of those verses, they all follow the same pattern. The decentralizing of God as the source of meaning and belonging and purpose, and then people are left scrambling to find their own systems of meaning and purpose. And into this vacuum, the dark presence inevitably sweeps in to take control, because one of the great insights of early Christian theology that we would be wise to recover in our churches today is that the dark presence in this universe is exactly that, a darkness, a void, a nothingness, a place where meaning and purpose cannot exist because the source of existence itself has been turned away from. And when we walk away from the meaning provided by God, we are forced to make our own meaning, because we can't make our way in the world without a meaning. When we walk away from the belonging that we find in God, we are forced to find our own belonging. When we walk away from the justice of God, we are forced to invent our own justice. And people will never agree on that, by the way. When we walk away from the value that God gives us, we are forced to prove our own value in and to the world. And this all inevitably leads to futile and embarrassing situations like trying to prove your worth or worthiness by taking a seat at the head table at a wedding reception, even though you are not part of the wedding party. And if we were not seeing actual living, real life proof of these teachings in our world right now, today, in real time, I would personally be tempted to follow the more liberal branches of the church, which say that we should not hold so tightly to these ideas, that we should try to embrace or accept or acknowledge other forms of meaning and purpose in life. I do take a more liberal approach to the Bible a lot of the time. I am a postmodernist at heart. It's how I was raised. Don't blame me for that, please. But, the thing is, we have tried this experiment. My entire lifetime basically has been this grand experiment in make your own truth, follow your own heart, pursue your own dreams at the expense of everything else. These are not new or novel concepts to me. These are the concepts with which I was raised in this world. And now my generation, I'm an older millennial, to be clear, but my generation is now raising children. And we're also looking at the 20-something-year-old generation. And what we're seeing is this horrifying conclusion to the experiment. The mental health crisis, the loneliness epidemic, the inability to find romantic partners or even friends. This extreme animosity that both sides of the political spectrum and also both sides of the church spectrum have toward each other. This inability to listen or even accept that other people have opinions separate from your own. This is a very ironic conclusion, right? For the generation that was told truth is relative and pursue your own truth. But it is the conclusion that we've come to. Moral relativism has not, in fact, resulted in everyone being able to get along better. The actual result has been hate anyone who disagrees with your truth. And then there's this thing called addiction. And addiction takes many and various forms, but the single largest result to this grand experiment that we have been running for the last 30 or 40 years is addiction. And it's not just addiction to illegal drugs or alcohol. Those things are a huge problem. But there are many other forms of it. There's addiction to food, and pornography, swearing. Yes, people are addicted to swearing. It's true. Other lazy forms of speech, lazy entertainment, lazy living. And now AI, which is a great tool. I honestly use it all the time, but like everything, it has its dark side. And a disturbingly large number of people, I was watching a news report on this just yesterday, and a disturbingly large number of people are now in emotional, romantic relationships with artificial intelligence. And, it does not surprise me. To be perfectly honest, it doesn't surprise me. And I'm not sure I even find it all that more disturbing than other forms of addiction, because that's really all it is. And when you think about it, it's really just another form of pornography. And here's something fun on that whole term. I was using to write this sermon, I was using, for part of it at least, the dictation software that's in Microsoft Word. So I was speaking these words aloud, and then it was writing them on the screen. And it would not write out the word pornography. It was really funny, too, because it did write it out, and then it quickly deleted it and replaced it with all asterisks. Every single time I had to go back in there and physically erase the asterisks and write the word. And actually, a few times I just didn't, because I know what it is, so I didn't bother. But our technology, what we have placed so much trust and hope and meaning in, is literally not allowing us now to talk about the very things that are most affecting our lives. Because this is actually, if you're not familiar, this is actually a prevalent thing. In fact, when I put this on YouTube, I'm probably going to have to censor that word too, because the YouTube bots will flag it as inappropriate. Other issues too, other serious issues that we really need to talk about, like let's call it voluntary death, we can't say that word aloud either on YouTube. We can't really talk about death in any form, especially if it's violent on YouTube. We're in the middle of a suicide epidemic. We cannot say that word on social media. You know, the censorship is very real. And YouTube creators have gotten very creative. If you ever hear on YouTube someone talking about corn in a way that doesn't make sense for the vegetable, it's because they can't say the real word. And the other one is self-deleting is one of them. There are a few others for the other words. We've gotten creative. We are outthinking the robots. There's hope. But you know, the censorship and the internet realm is a very real thing, and it's actually not the government that is doing it. It's our own social platforms. And it's actually done under, ironically, the banner of inclusion and making everyone feel safe and freedom of expression even. And you know, if this isn't an example of a broken cistern, our machines literally not letting us talk about what we need to talk about. Machines we built to make our lives better and easier. You know, if this isn't an example of a broken cistern, I don't know what is. Now, one of the things that has struck me recently is just how much the Bible actually does talk about the subject of addiction. And that's from a time, you know, there's no word for addiction in the Bible or in those ancient languages. The very concept of addiction as we know it didn't exist in the ancient world. Drunkenness or drunkard is probably as close as you come. And yet there is a very accurate portrayal of the effects of addiction throughout the Bible. And it's much more frequent than I realized just a few months ago. And I'm now tempted to say that, you know, the main concept of sin may actually be describable with the concept of addiction in the Bible. And when I think about it, that's not a new notion to me. It's something that I've had in my head for a while. I just really haven't thought through the terminology yet. But it makes a lot of sense, you know, when we think we were created to be dependent on a lot of things. You know, we were created to be reminded that we are not self-contained entities in this universe. We are not be-alls and end-alls in ourselves. We are dependent on our environment, on the precise measurements of pressure and heat, cold and gravity. We are dependent, addicted, born addicted, you might say, to oxygen, to food, and to water. And there's a reason God is so often compared to oxygen, breath, food, and water. And it's because in addition to these physical dependencies, I believe we are also born dependent on certain emotional, intellectual, and spiritual things. We are addicted to the concept that there is justice in this world. We are addicted to the concept that there is meaning in life. And when we remove God from the source of justice and meaning, we have to fill that void somehow. And then we end up filling our lives with things that do not actually improve our lives, like AI girlfriends, apparently a thing. You know, that's what the great 40-year experiment has now proven. And, you know, as Christians and as the church, we really cannot expect the outside world to accept or acknowledge or live by any of this. And I've come to the conclusion that, at least personally, convincing the outside world of the error of its ways, you really should find some actual friends and get off ChatGPT, which is one of the big AI models. It's really not my job, at least not for right now. My operational concern in life, I guess you could say, at least for now, is the church and all the tragic degree to which we have decentralized God from our churches. And I want to be clear that this is a universal problem in the church. This is not a liberal thing. It's not a conservative thing. Both extreme positions in the politics and in the academic world, the people who have power over the church, on both sides have dug cisterns for themselves, cisterns that cannot actually hold water. They have decentralized God from what they are doing. And now churches everywhere are living in the aftermath of that. It's not a liberal problem. It's not a conservative problem. It's a both-and problem. And now we have to figure out how to deal with it. And you know, what I'm coming more and more to realize is that these systemic issues that are so big and so hard to deal with, the solving of them really has to start on individual levels, one person at a time. And so if there is one thing I encourage you to take away from all of this and keep with you in the week ahead, is that it's about where you find your personal worth and your belonging. And do you find it in God first and beyond all else? Because you do have worth to God individually. That is where your meaning comes from. You are created in the image of your Creator, and you're created to do things in this world for God. And from there, from taking that into ourselves and understanding it on our individual levels, which is something I personally still struggle with, but it's meant to spread from us to the outside. We are meant to know it first inside ourselves and then be able to communicate with other people how they might too find their worth in God. But it starts inside ourselves. Now, where do we get our water from? Where do we get what we need from as individuals? Now, at the age of 38, I am still trying to figure it out. And yes, 38 feels old to me. Just saying. It was literally my entire lifetime. So. But to take a look at these things in the week ahead, where does our meaning come from? Where are we digging our wells? Are they connected to the living water? Or are we trying to fill them from outside with things that don't really matter? And also remember, ChatGPT, a great tool for researching, is not a life partner. And